You should learn the difference between serving rich people and belonging near them. The words sliced through the rooftop restaurant so sharply that even the violinist near the marble staircase missed a note. Conversation stalled beneath the gold chandelier light. Crystal glasses froze halfway to painted lips. Somewhere beyond the skyline windows, cold Chicago rain streaked down the glass and silver lines, but inside Oraline Steakhouse, the air suddenly felt heavier than the storm outside. Ethan Whitmore leaned back in his leather chair at the center table of the investor gala, one hand resting beside a half-finished $1,200 bottle of Bordeaux. At 46, the billionaire hotel investor carried the kind of presence that made entire rooms rearrange themselves around him. Tailored charcoal suit. Platinum watch. Calm eyes that rarely softened. The type of man magazines called brilliant and employees called terrifying when cameras were off. Across from him stood Naomi Brooks, holding a silver tray lined with untouched champagne flutes. Her black uniform was spotless despite the chaos of the dinner rush, and the soft amber lighting caught the delicate gold pin attached near her collar. Unlike the others moving anxiously around the room, she stood perfectly still. Calm. Controlled. Unshaken. Ethan's jaw tightened as he glanced at his watch. I asked for the champagne 7 minutes ago, he said coldly. Do you people enjoy wasting executives' time? A nervous manager rushed forward immediately. Sir, we sincerely apologize. The kitchen was handling it. Ethan lifted one finger, silencing him without effort. His eyes never left Naomi. No, he said quietly. She can answer. Around them, wealthy investors shifted awkwardly in their seats. Someone coughed into a napkin. A woman near the balcony slowly lowered her phone, sensing something uncomfortable unfolding. Naomi finally spoke, her voice smooth and steady. There was an issue with one of the ovens downstairs, sir. We prioritized guest safety before service speed. Ethan gave a humorless laugh. Guest safety? He gestured toward the tray. It's champagne, not heart surgery. A few uneasy chuckles slipped through the room, though most faces remained tense. Naomi didn't react. She simply stepped forward to place the glasses onto the table. Then Ethan reached for one too quickly. The edge of his watch clipped the tray. Crystal exploded across the white tablecloth. Champagne splashed onto a senator's jacket. Gasps rippled through the dining room. One flute spun across the polished floor before shattering near the piano. Silence crashed over the rooftop. Ethan looked down at the mess, then slowly back up at Naomi as though the entire disaster belonged to her alone. Unbelievable, he muttered. This is exactly why people like you shouldn't be handling luxury service. The sentence hung in the air like smoke. Several staff members froze completely. One young busman near the kitchen doors looked horrified. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly toward the broken glass scattered beside Ethan's polished shoes. Then she crouched carefully, gathering the sharp pieces into a linen towel without a single complaint. Her movements remained graceful, measured, dignified. Ethan watched her for a moment before shaking his head in disgust. You know what the problem is, he continued. Too many businesses confuse kindness with standards. Naomi rose slowly, the towel folded neatly in her hands now. The entire rooftop seemed to wait for her response. Outside, thunder rolled faintly over Lake Michigan. Then, at last, she looked directly into Ethan's eyes and said softly, I hope no one ever speaks to your daughter that way someday. The words landed differently than the others. Not angry. Not bitter. Honest. Ethan's expression flickered for half a second. Just enough for something buried underneath years of power and polished control to react. Before he could answer, the restaurant manager suddenly appeared beside Naomi, pale with panic. And in a voice barely above a whisper he said, Ms. Brooks, the board members have arrived upstairs. They're waiting for you. The rooftop remained painfully quiet after the manager spoke those words. Ms. Brooks. Not Naomi. Not waitress. Not server. The title seemed to ripple across the dining room more loudly than the thunder outside. Ethan Whitmore noticed it immediately. So did everyone else seated beneath the amber lights and towering windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Naomi turned calmly toward the manager, still holding the folded linen towel against her hands. Not a trace of embarrassment crossed her face. "Tell them I will be there in 10 minutes, she said softly. The manager nodded at once. "Yes, ma'am." "Ma'am." Again. Ethan leaned back slowly in his chair, eyes narrowing as the manager hurried away toward the private elevator near the wine cellar entrance. Something about the exchange unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Around the room, waiters moved carefully through the tense silence, replacing broken glass and fresh linens with almost military precision. Yet every single employee who passed Naomi gave her the same look. Respect. Genuine respect. Not fear. Not obligation. Ethan had spent 20 years building billion-dollar deals. He understood hierarchy instinctively. And what he saw in that room did not match a normal restaurant chain. Naomi handed the towel quietly to another server before reaching for a fresh champagne bottle from the service cart nearby. "Your guests deserve a clean table," she said. Her voice remained composed, almost gentle, as if the humiliation from moments earlier had never happened at all. Ethan studied her carefully now. The gold pin near her collar reflected softly beneath the chandelier light. He realized it was not decorative. It carried the restaurant's original crest engraved in black enamel. Oraline Hospitality Group. Founders Collection. Strange. Most servers would never wear something like that. Before he could think further, Senator Delaney cleared his throat awkwardly beside him. "Ethan," he muttered quietly, adjusting his stained jacket. "Maybe let it go." Ethan ignored him. "You seem surprisingly calm for someone who just embarrassed herself in front of half the city." Naomi poured champagne into fresh crystal glasses with steady hands. "People reveal themselves under pressure," she replied. "I try not to interrupt the process." A few investors exchanged uncomfortable glances. Ethan almost laughed at the answer, but something stopped him. She was not defensive. She was observing him. That realization irritated him more than the accident itself. Near the kitchen doors, the young busboy from earlier stepped toward Naomi carrying a replacement tray. He could not have been older than 16. "Miss Brooks," he whispered nervously. "Chef Alvarez asked if you still want the investor tasting menu delayed." Naomi nodded once. "Only until the emergency inspection downstairs is complete." The boy hesitated. "Are you sure you want to stay out here?" Her expression softened slightly. "They deserve service, Daniel. Not discomfort." The boy gave a small nod and hurried away. Ethan caught every word. Inspection? Delay? Investors? Nothing aligned correctly anymore. Across the rooftop, the executive chef himself suddenly emerged from the kitchen. Guests straightened instantly when they recognized him. Mateo Alvarez was famous enough to appear on magazine covers and national television. Yet instead of addressing the investors, the celebrated chef walked directly to Naomi. Then, to Ethan's complete disbelief, the chef lowered his voice respectfully and asked, "Would you like me to remove the bourbon pairing from table 12? Naomi glanced briefly toward an elderly couple seated near the piano. "No," she answered. "The husband requested it personally last month." "Keep it." "Of course," Chef Alvarez replied immediately. He returned to the kitchen without another word. Ethan stared after him in silence. The chef had not spoken to her like an employee. He had spoken like a man following instructions. Rain tapped harder now against the glass walls surrounding the rooftop. Beyond the skyline, lightning flickered over Lake Michigan, washing silver across Naomi's face for half a second. Then she reached for the leather check presenter resting near Ethan's untouched plate, and placed it gently beside his hand. "Your dinner is covered tonight," she said quietly. Ethan frowned. "I did not ask for charity." Naomi met his eyes one final time. "It is not charity, Mr. Whitmore." Her voice lowered slightly. "It is courtesy." Then she turned and walked toward the private elevator at the far end of the restaurant. And as she crossed the dining room floor, every employee she passed instinctively stepped aside. The private elevator doors closed behind Naomi Brooks with a soft metallic whisper, leaving Ethan Whitmore staring at his untouched champagne glass as though it might explain what had just happened. Around him, conversation slowly returned to the rooftop dining room, but something fundamental had shifted. The laughter sounded forced now. Careful. Guests who had once leaned toward Ethan with admiration suddenly avoided holding eye contact too long. Even the violinist near the staircase played softer than before. Ethan hated rooms that changed without his permission. He adjusted the cuff of his charcoal jacket and reached for the leather check presenter Naomi had left beside his plate. The black cover felt heavier than expected. Inside, there was no receipt. No signature line. Just a cream-colored card embossed with the Oraline crest in gold foil. One handwritten sentence sat neatly across the center in dark ink. The way a man treats invisible people reveals everything. Ethan read the sentence twice. Then a third time. His jaw tightened slightly. "What kind of game is this?" he muttered under his breath. Senator Delaney leaned closer from across the table. "Maybe it is not a game." Ethan slid the card shut immediately. "A waitress does not psychoanalyze me over dinner." Yet even as he said it, he no longer believed the word waitress fit her properly. The rooftop staff moved differently around Naomi. Too careful. Too respectful. Almost protective. Ethan stood from the table and loosened the front button of his suit jacket. Through the towering glass walls, Chicago shimmered below in streaks of rain and traffic lights, the city glowing gold against the storm-dark sky. He needed air. Needed distance from the strange tension creeping under his skin. As he crossed the dining room toward the balcony corridor, he noticed several framed photographs lining the hallway wall beside the wine cellar entrance. Awards. Celebrity visits. Magazine covers. Oraline had built an empire around elegance and exclusivity. Ethan barely glanced at the first few frames until one image stopped him cold. Naomi stood in the center of the photograph beside the mayor of Chicago during a ribbon-cutting ceremony. Not serving drinks. Not standing in the background. Center stage. Wearing a midnight blue suit and holding ceremonial scissors while reporters crowded around her. Ethan stepped closer. The plaque beneath the photo read, "Naomi Brooks opening Oraline South Loop flagship location. Founder and executive chairwoman." Ethan stared at the words for several long seconds. Founder. Executive chairwoman. The sounds of the restaurant faded beneath the pounding in his ears. Another frame beside it showed Naomi shaking hands with a governor. Another featured her on the cover of Midwest Business Monthly beneath the headline "The Woman Who Changed Luxury Dining." Ethan felt his stomach tighten. Behind him, footsteps approached quietly. Daniel, the young busboy from earlier, nearly dropped a stack of folded linens when he realized Ethan was standing there. "Sir?" he said nervously. Ethan pointed sharply toward the photographs. "Why is she dressed like an executive in these?" Daniel blinked. "Because she is one." Ethan gave a disbelieving laugh. "Then why is she carrying trays downstairs?" Daniel hesitated. His young face shifted uncomfortably before he answered. "Miss Brooks works every level of the restaurants herself." Ethan frowned. "That does not answer my question." The boy swallowed hard. "She says people act differently around workers they think nobody notices." Ethan looked back toward Naomi's photograph. The confidence in her expression unsettled him more now than it had earlier in person. Because in the picture, she was not pretending to belong in power. She clearly owned it. A nearby server passed carrying crystal dessert plates, and immediately stopped when she noticed Ethan staring at the wall. "Everything all right, sir?" she asked politely. Ethan pointed again toward the frames. "Why did nobody tell me who she was?" The woman's eyes widened slightly. Then, very carefully, she replied, "Nobody asked, Mr. Whitmore?" Before Ethan could respond, the private elevator at the end of the hallway chimed softly. The silver doors slid open upstairs. Voices drifted downward. From the penthouse level above the restaurant. Deep voices. Executive voices. And then one sentence echoed clearly through the quiet corridor. The board meeting cannot begin until Ms. Brooks arrives. The hallway outside the private elevator suddenly felt smaller around Ethan Whitmore. The soft jazz floating up from the rooftop dining room no longer sounded elegant. It sounded distant. Artificial. Like music playing inside someone else's life. He stared upward toward the glowing elevator numbers above the silver doors while rain continued tapping softly against the floor-to-ceiling windows beside him. Ms. Brooks. Founder and executive chairwoman. The words kept replaying in his head with slow, humiliating clarity. Behind him, servers moved carefully through the corridor carrying dessert trays topped with gold-dusted chocolate soufflés and crystal espresso cups. But every employee who passed now avoided lingering near Ethan for too long. Not out of fear. Out of discomfort. For the first time in years, Ethan could feel the social temperature of a room shifting against him. The elevator chimed once more. A pair of men in dark tailored suits stepped out carrying sleek leather portfolios embossed with the Oraline crest. Executives. One of them stopped immediately when he noticed Ethan standing there. "Mr. Whitmore," the man said politely, though his smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Ethan recognized him at once. Gregory Hale. Senior Acquisitions Attorney for Oraline Hospitality Group. They had crossed paths during private investment conferences in New York and Los Angeles before. Gregory glanced briefly toward the photographs on the wall, then back at Ethan with visible caution. "I was not aware you were attending tonight's internal session." Ethan folded his arms. "Apparently I was not aware either." Gregory adjusted his glasses carefully. "The board meeting upstairs is confidential." Ethan gave a cold smile. "Funny. Considering your chairwoman spent the last hour serving wine downstairs." The second executive shifted awkwardly at that comment. Gregory, however, remained composed. "Ms. Brooks believes leadership should never become disconnected from service." Ethan let out a quiet breath through his nose. "You mean she enjoys testing people?" Gregory's expression changed slightly then. Not defensive. Observant. "Sometimes," he answered carefully. "People reveal more than quarterly reports ever could." Ethan looked away toward the city skyline beyond the rain-streaked glass. Thousands of lights blurred together beneath the storm clouds hanging over Chicago. He suddenly remembered Naomi kneeling beside the shattered crystal earlier without raising her voice once. No anger. No humiliation visible on her face. Only dignity. That memory unsettled him far more now than it had in the moment. The elevator doors slid open again. This time, Naomi stepped out. The rooftop lighting caught her differently now. Gone was the silver tray. Gone was the service posture. She wore the same black uniform, yet somehow the entire corridor adjusted around her presence the second she appeared. Executives straightened instinctively. Staff members paused. Even Gregory stepped slightly aside to clear her path. Naomi's eyes landed on Ethan calmly. Neither surprised nor triumphant. Just steady. "Mr. Whitmore," she said softly. Ethan held her gaze. "You could have told me who you were." Naomi tilted her head slightly. "Would it have changed how you spoke to me?" The question landed harder than Ethan expected. He opened his mouth to answer but stopped. Because he did not know. A long silence settled between them while thunder rolled faintly across the city outside. Finally Ethan spoke again, quieter this time. "You made a fool out of me." Naomi's expression softened almost invisibly. "No," she replied gently. "You did that on your own." Gregory looked down immediately, pretending to review paperwork. Somewhere behind them, a wine glass clinked against silver from the dining room below. Ethan felt heat rise beneath his collar despite the cold air drifting through the corridor vents. No investor had spoken to him this way in over a decade. Yet Naomi did not sound cruel. She sounded disappointed. And somehow that felt worse. She glanced briefly toward the private elevator again. "The board is waiting." Then she looked back at Ethan one final time. "You came here tonight to discuss purchasing a stake in Oraline." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. "That was the plan." Naomi nodded once. "Then perhaps before discussing ownership," she said softly, You should understand the people who built it. Without another word, she stepped into the elevator. Gregory and the other executives followed immediately behind her. But just before the doors closed completely, Ethan heard one sentence drift out from inside the elevator in a respectful whisper. "Good evening, Chairwoman Brooks." The elevator doors closed softly, leaving Ethan Whitmore alone in the corridor with nothing but the distant hum of jazz music and the reflection of his own face in the rain-dark windows. For several seconds he did not move. The city lights below Chicago blurred against the glass like streaks of gold, and silver paint melting into the storm. Somewhere downstairs, guests laughed too loudly at conversations they were no longer enjoying. Ethan could feel it now. The entire atmosphere of the evening had shifted beyond his control. He hated that feeling more than failure itself. Gregory Hale's final words echoed in his mind. "Chairwoman Brooks." Ethan loosened his tie slightly and looked back toward the framed photographs lining the hallway wall. Earlier they had seemed impressive. Now they felt accusing. Naomi standing beside governors. Naomi cutting ribbons at grand openings. Naomi shaking hands with hospitality executives in Paris and New York. In every picture, she wore the same calm expression she had carried while kneeling beside broken crystal at his feet less than an hour earlier. Not pride. Not arrogance. Confidence earned slowly. Ethan stared at one particular photograph longer than the others. Naomi stood in the middle of a commercial kitchen surrounded by cooks and dishwashers, smiling while holding a tray of cornbread rolls. No diamonds. No staged glamour. Just flour on her sleeves and steam rising behind her beneath industrial lights. The plaque beneath the frame read, "Oraline Employee Appreciation Day. Year 1. Ethan frowned slightly. Year 1. Oraline now operated in 12 states with properties worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Yet she had started in kitchens. Actual kitchens. The realization settled uncomfortably inside him. A nearby service door opened quietly. Chef Mateo Alvarez stepped into a hallway carrying a tablet and a stack of printed menus. He stopped when he noticed Ethan still standing there alone. "Mr. Whitmore," the chef said politely. Ethan nodded once. "Chef." Mateo glanced briefly toward the elevator before lowering his voice. "The board meeting upstairs may take some time." Ethan gave a dry laugh. "Apparently I am not invited anymore." Mateo remained silent for a moment. Then he surprised Ethan by saying, "Miss Brooks never cared much about titles." Ethan crossed his arms. "Funny. Everyone else seems to." Mateo smiled faintly at that. "Because most people here remember where this company began." Ethan looked back toward the kitchen photo again. "And where was that?" The chef shifted the menus beneath his arm. "A 70-seat diner on the south side." Ethan blinked. "You are telling me she built all this from a diner?" Mateo nodded slowly. "With 3 employees and a second-hand oven that overheated every afternoon." His eyes softened slightly with memory. "She worked doubles for years. Served tables herself. Washed dishes after midnight. Paid employees before paying herself." Ethan said nothing. The storm outside deepened, thunder rumbling low across Lake Michigan, while the rooftop lights reflected softly against the marble floors. Mateo continued quietly. "You know what she interviews for before hiring executives?" Ethan glanced at him. "What?" The chef gave a small shrug. "Respect." Ethan almost scoffed automatically, but stopped himself. Because suddenly he remembered every word he had thrown at Naomi downstairs. "People like you should not be handling luxury service." Heat crept into his chest again, though this time it did not feel like anger. Mateo studied him carefully now. "She notices everything, Mr. Whitmore. The way investors speak to hosts. The way managers treat dishwashers. The way wealthy people react when they think service workers are invisible." Ethan looked away toward the city lights. "So tonight was some kind of test?" Mateo answered. "Honestly, no." He paused briefly. "But it became one." Silence settled heavily between them. Somewhere inside the dining room below, silverware clinked softly against china. Ethan suddenly realized he had not touched his dinner in nearly 40 minutes. He had spent his entire career believing power revealed itself through money, influence, and control. Yet upstairs, the woman he had humiliated carried more authority in one quiet sentence than most executives carried in a lifetime of speeches. The elevator chimed again suddenly. Ethan turned instinctively toward the silver doors, expecting another executive. Instead, Daniel the young busboy stepped out carrying a slim black folder pressed carefully against his chest. "Mr. Whitmore?" the boy asked nervously. Ethan straightened slightly. "Yes?" Daniel extended the folder toward him with both hands. "Miss Brooks asked me to give you this." Ethan took it slowly. The folder felt expensive. Heavy. Embossed with Aureline's gold crest. "What is it?" he asked. Daniel swallowed hard before answering. "Your investor evaluation report, sir." The black folder felt strangely cold in Ethan Whitmore's hands. For a moment he simply stared at the embossed Aureline crest reflecting beneath the hallway lights while rain rolled slowly down the windows behind him. Investor evaluation report. No one had ever evaluated him before. Not banks. Not boards. Not the men whose companies depended on his signature to survive. Ethan was the one who judged. The one who approved. The one who walked away while others waited for answers. Yet standing there in the quiet corridor outside the private elevator, he suddenly felt the unfamiliar pressure of being measured by someone else. Daniel shifted nervously beside him. "Miss Brooks said you should read it alone, sir." Ethan glanced at the young busboy. "And what exactly is in this report?" The boy swallowed. "I do not know everything." His voice lowered slightly. "But the board uses them before approving partnerships." Ethan let out a short breath through his nose. "Partnerships worth hundreds of millions of dollars are decided by restaurant staff observations?" Daniel hesitated carefully before answering. "Miss Brooks says numbers can predict profit. But character predicts damage." The sentence landed with uncomfortable precision. Ethan looked back down at the folder. Somewhere upstairs, muffled voices echoed faintly through the ceiling above the corridor. Executives discussing investments, expansion, contracts. And somewhere in that meeting sat Naomi Brooks, the woman he had spoken down to less than an hour ago, while believing she carried trays for a living. Ethan suddenly remembered the exact look in her eyes when she said, "I hope no one ever speaks to your daughter that way someday." Not anger. Sadness. As though she had already seen too many powerful men fail simple human tests. He opened the folder slowly. Inside sat several printed pages stamped confidential across the top. Aureline Investor Ethics Review. Ethan's jaw tightened immediately. The first page listed categories. Treatment of staff. Emotional regulation. Leadership under inconvenience. Respect towards service employees. Observed reactions during operational disruption. Ethan stared at the paper in disbelief. This was not financial due diligence. It was personal. Brutally personal. Beneath each category sat detailed notes typed in clean black lettering. At 7:14 p.m., investor displayed impatience toward delayed service during confirmed kitchen safety issue. At 7:19 p.m., investor publicly assigned blame without verifying circumstances. At 7:23 p.m., investor used class-based language toward frontline employee. Ethan's chest tightened as he continued reading. Every word was factual. Precise. Impossible to argue against. He had said those things. Done those things. For years people around him had softened his behavior with excuses. Stress. Pressure. Genius. But on paper, stripped of status and money, the actions looked exactly as ugly as they sounded. A final paragraph near the bottom caught his attention. Subject demonstrates strong executive discipline and negotiation instincts. However, current behavioral patterns suggest emotional detachment from working-class personnel. Recommendation pending chairwoman review. Ethan stared at the final sentence for several long seconds. Recommendation. Pending chairwoman review. Not the board. Not attorneys. Naomi. The realization hit harder than he expected. His entire billion-dollar proposal now rested in the hands of the woman he had humiliated over broken champagne glasses. Footsteps approached quietly down the corridor. Ethan looked up to see Senator Delaney walking toward him with his coat draped over one arm. "There you are," the senator muttered softly. "The investors downstairs are wondering why you disappeared." Ethan closed the folder immediately. "Maybe I needed perspective." The senator studied him carefully. "You all right?" Ethan almost answered automatically. Almost gave the polished billionaire response everyone expected from him. But instead he looked back toward the elevator and said quietly, "I think I spent 20 years becoming the kind of man I used to hate." Senator Delaney frowned slightly but said nothing. Thunder rolled low across the skyline again. Ethan leaned against the marble wall beside the photographs and closed his eyes briefly. A memory surfaced suddenly from years ago. His mother working double shifts at a roadside diner outside Milwaukee. Her tired hands carrying coffee pots through crowded booths. The way businessmen used to snap fingers at her without looking directly at her face. Ethan had sworn as a teenager he would become rich enough that nobody could ever treat him like that again. Somewhere along the way, he had become the men at those booths. The elevator chimed softly once more. Ethan opened his eyes as the silver doors slid apart upstairs. Naomi stepped out alone this time, holding a tablet against her side. Her expression remained calm when she saw him waiting there. Then she spoke the one sentence Ethan Whitmore never expected to hear directed at him. "Mr. Whitmore," she said quietly, "the board would like to know if you still believe you are qualified to lead people." The question settled into the corridor with almost unbearable stillness. "Mr. Whitmore, the board would like to know if you still believe you are qualified to lead people." Ethan stood motionless beside the rain-covered windows while Naomi Brooks watched him calmly from a few feet away. There was no cruelty in her voice. No satisfaction. Somehow that made the moment worse. Because for the first time in years, Ethan could not hide behind anger. The storm outside deepened over Chicago, lightning briefly illuminating the skyline in pale silver flashes that reflected across the marble floors and gold-framed photographs surrounding them. Ethan looked down at the investor report still open in his hand. The words blurred together now beneath the weight building in his chest. Treatment of staff. Emotional regulation. Respect towards service employees. Simple things. Human things. Things he once understood long before billion-dollar meetings and private jets convinced him that impatience was strength. He slowly lifted his eyes toward Naomi. "You already know the answer, do not you?" Naomi remained quiet for a moment before stepping closer. Not intimidatingly. Gently. "No," she said softly. "I know who you were tonight." Ethan swallowed hard. Somewhere downstairs, the restaurant piano shifted into a slower melody, while muted conversations floated upward through the open staircase. The evening continued below them as though nothing life-changing had happened at all. But for Ethan, the world suddenly felt uncomfortably exposed. He gave a dry laugh beneath his breath. "You know what is funny?" Naomi waited silently. Ethan stared out toward the rain-soaked skyline again. "My mother worked in a diner outside Milwaukee when I was growing up." Naomi's expression shifted slightly with surprise, though she said nothing. Ethan continued quietly, his voice rougher now. "Double shifts. 6 days a week. Coffee stains on her apron every night." His jaw tightened as old memories surfaced unexpectedly clear. "I remember businessmen snapping fingers at her because their pie was cold. I remember one man telling her she should smile more if she wanted better tips." Naomi listened carefully without interrupting. Ethan let out a slow breath. "I hated those men." Thunder rolled low outside the windows. Ethan looked down at his own reflection in the glass. Expensive suit. Platinum watch. Perfectly polished image. And suddenly he saw exactly what Naomi had seen earlier downstairs. One of those men. "When I became successful," he said quietly, "I told myself I earned the right to demand excellence." His voice lowered further. "Somewhere along the way, demanding excellence turned into looking down on people. Silence settled gently between them. Then Naomi spoke for the first time in nearly a minute. Power does not change people, Mr. Whitmore. Her eyes held his steadily. It reveals what they stopped correcting inside themselves. Ethan closed the investor folder slowly. The words struck with painful accuracy. He thought about every assistant he had ignored. Every exhausted employee he had treated like part of the furniture in expensive rooms. Every time success became an excuse for forgetting basic dignity. For years, nobody had challenged him directly because too many people depended on his approval to survive professionally. But Naomi had nothing to gain from flattering him. That truth stripped away every defense he normally used. Why do you still work downstairs? He asked suddenly. Naomi glanced briefly toward the rooftop dining room behind them. Because I promised myself something when I opened my first restaurant. Ethan frowned slightly. What? Her voice softened. That no employee in my company would ever feel invisible the way my mother did. Ethan looked at her carefully now. Truly looked. Not the uniform. Not the tray. The woman herself. The calm strength in her posture. The exhaustion hidden behind graceful composure. The quiet intelligence in her eyes. And suddenly he understood something deeply uncomfortable. Naomi Brooks had not built Oraline despite serving people. She built it because she understood service better than the wealthy executives trying to buy into it. The elevator chimed softly behind them. Gregory Hales stepped out holding a tablet against his chest. Chairwoman Brooks, he said respectfully, the board is ready for the final vote. Ethan immediately straightened. Final vote? Gregory hesitated before answering carefully. Regarding the partnership proposal. Ethan's chest tightened again. Naomi turned toward the elevator briefly, then looked back at him one final time. There is still one seat open upstairs, she said quietly. Ethan blinked in surprise. You still want me in that room? Naomi studied him carefully beneath the warm hallway lights. That depends, she replied softly. Are you prepared to walk into it as a billionaire? She paused. Or as a human being? For several seconds, Ethan Whitmore could not answer. The hallway seemed suspended in silence except for the soft hum of the elevator lights, and the distant rain pressing against the windows overlooking Chicago. Are you prepared to walk into it as a billionaire or as a human being? Naomi's question stayed between them like something alive. Ethan looked at the woman standing in front of him, and realized she had given him something almost nobody in his world ever offered anymore. The truth without fear. Gregory Hales stepped politely aside beside the elevator doors, waiting. Naomi remained calm, tablet resting lightly against her side, the gold crest near her collar catching the warm hallway lights. Ethan suddenly noticed how exhausted she looked beneath her composure. Not weak. Just tired in the way people become after carrying responsibility for too many others over too many years. He thought about the 70-seat diner Chef Alvarez described earlier. The second-hand oven. The double shifts. The employees she protected because she remembered what invisibility felt like. Ethan slowly loosened the rest of his tie and slipped it free from his collar. Then he folded it once and placed it carefully into his jacket pocket. Gregory blinked in visible surprise. Naomi's expression softened slightly, though she said nothing. Ethan looked directly at her. I do not think the billionaire deserves the seat upstairs tonight. The elevator remained open. Waiting. Ethan glanced once toward the rooftop dining room behind them where crystal chandeliers glowed above wealthy guests finishing expensive desserts they barely tasted anymore. Then he made a decision that surprised even himself. But before I walk into that boardroom, he said quietly, there is something I need to do first. Naomi studied him carefully. What? Ethan turned toward the kitchen corridor. I owe people an apology. The industrial kitchen beneath. Oraline's rooftop looked nothing like the polished dining room above. Steam curled upward beneath fluorescent lights. Metal pans clattered against stovetops. Orders moved quickly between cooks while dishwashers worked through towers of plates beside hissing sinks. The air smelled of garlic, butter, coffee, and rain-soaked coats drying near the employee lockers. The moment Ethan entered the kitchen, Conversations lowered noticeably. Staff members recognized him instantly. Some looked uncomfortable. Others avoided eye contact entirely. Ethan felt every ounce of that tension pressing against him. Chef Mateo Alvarez paused near the prep station, eyebrows lifting slightly in surprise. Ethan stepped forward slowly. "Can I say something?" The kitchen quieted almost completely. Even the dishwashing station slowed. Ethan looked around at the workers surrounding him. Young line cooks. Servers balancing trays. Older women folding fresh linens near the pantry shelves. People he normally would have passed without learning their names. His throat tightened unexpectedly. "Earlier tonight," he began quietly, "I spoke to one of your employees in a way that was arrogant and disrespectful." Nobody moved. Ethan swallowed once before continuing. "The truth is, I have spoken to a lot of working people that way for years." He looked briefly toward the floor. "And somewhere along the way, success convinced me that impatience was intelligence." The kitchen remained completely silent now except for the low hum of refrigeration units. Ethan lifted his eyes again. "I was wrong." A young waitress near the espresso station blinked rapidly in shock. One dishwasher actually stopped scrubbing plates altogether. Ethan continued, voice steadier now. "My mother worked in restaurants her whole life. I forgot what that looked like. Forgot what that sacrifice cost people." He glanced toward Chef Alvarez. "Tonight your chairwoman reminded me." Across the room, Daniel stood frozen beside the storage shelves holding a stack of folded napkins against his chest. Ethan let out a slow breath. "So I am apologizing. Not because it helps a business deal." He paused briefly. "Because you deserve better than what I showed you." Silence followed again. Heavy. Honest. Then unexpectedly, one of the older cooks near the grill station nodded once. Another employee quietly returned to plating desserts. The tension in the room eased almost invisibly, like steam slowly leaving a sealed pipe. Chef Alvarez stepped closer and crossed his arms thoughtfully. "Most wealthy men apologize when cameras are watching," he said. Ethan gave a faint humorless smile. "There are no cameras here." Mateo studied him carefully for another second. Then, for the first time all night, the chef extended his hand. Ethan looked at it briefly before shaking it firmly. "Good," Mateo said quietly. "That means this one might actually matter." Behind them, Naomi stood silently near the kitchen entrance, watching everything. 3 months later, the first snowfall of December drifted softly across downtown Chicago as warm golden light spilled through the front windows of a newly renovated building on South Wabash Avenue. The brass plaque beside the entrance reflected beneath the street lamps in polished lettering. The Oraline Hospitality Academy. Founded on the belief that dignity belongs to every worker. People gathered quietly along the sidewalk despite the cold. Culinary students in dark aprons. Reporters balancing cameras beneath umbrellas. Former restaurant employees invited from across the city. Through the tall glass windows, laughter and piano music floated warmly into the winter air. Inside, the old building no longer looked abandoned. The once empty training center now glowed with life. Stainless steel kitchens shined beneath bright overhead lights. Fresh bread baked somewhere near the back hallways. Young students moved nervously through orientation tours while instructors adjusted white chef jackets and hospitality manuals stacked neatly on polished counters. Near the entrance, a teenage girl in worn sneakers stared wide-eyed at the enormous kitchen through the glass divider. Her mother stood beside her clutching a donated winter coat tightly around her shoulders. "You really think they would accept someone like me?" the girl whispered. Before her mother could answer, a calm voice behind them replied softly, "That is exactly who we built this place for." They turned to see Naomi Brooks approaching through the lobby in a tailored black coat with snowflakes melting gently across her sleeves. The girl immediately straightened nervously. Naomi smiled warmly. "What is your name?" "Kayla," the girl answered quietly. Naomi extended her hand without hesitation. "Welcome to Oraline Academy, Kayla." Across the lobby, Ethan Whitmore watched the exchange silently from beside the reception desk. He no longer wore the sharp charcoal suits that once made him look untouchable. Tonight his coat was simple navy wool, sleeves rolled slightly as he helped arrange orientation folders beside the front counter himself. Several reporters had already tried asking why a billionaire investor was personally greeting students at the entrance. Ethan only answered with the truth. Because I forgot what respect looked like until someone reminded me. He looked toward Naomi now as she guided Kayla and her mother through the lobby toward the kitchens. The same calm strength remained in her posture. The same quiet dignity. But tonight, for the first time since they met, Ethan noticed something softer beneath it. Hope. Chef Mateo Alvarez emerged from the training kitchen carrying trays of warm biscuits for the arriving families. Daniel, now promoted into the Academy Mentorship Program, hurried behind him carrying coffee cups for guests entering from the cold. The entire building pulsed with movement and purpose. Not luxury for appearance. Service with meaning. Ethan stepped toward the front entrance just as another family arrived from the snow outside. A small little girl in a faded pink jacket struggled awkwardly to pull out a chair for her grandmother near the welcome table. Without thinking, Ethan crossed the lobby immediately and pulled the chair back gently for them himself. The grandmother looked startled. "Thank you, sir." Ethan smiled softly. "You are very welcome." Across the room, Naomi noticed the interaction. Their eyes met briefly beneath the warm chandelier lights hanging over the academy lobby. No words passed between them at first. None were necessary anymore. Ethan slowly walked toward her while students and employees moved around them laughing quietly in the background. "You know," he said, glancing around the crowded academy, "I spent years believing leadership meant being the most powerful person in the room." Naomi folded her hands calmly in front of her coat. "And now?" Snow drifted gently outside the windows behind them while the scent of fresh bread filled the building. Ethan looked toward the students gathering around the kitchen stations. "Now I think leadership might just mean making sure nobody feels invisible." Naomi's expression softened fully then, the kind of smile that only appears when someone finally sees the thing they spent years trying to teach the world. Near the entrance, Kayla laughed quietly as Chef Alvarez handed her an oversized chef hat that slipped down over her eyes. The entire lobby burst into warm laughter around her. Ethan looked toward the sound and smiled too. And for the first time in a very long while, the richest man in the room no longer needed everyone to know it.